I'm really excited to be joined today by Tara Thiagarajan, the founder and chief scientist at Sapien Labs, whom I've been very lucky to know for almost 10 years at this point. Is that right, Tara?
Yeah, it's hard to believe.
I know, the time flies. Tara is doing some really incredible work to better understand the human mind, not just at the individual level, but across different cultures, environments, and communities all around the world, especially in some of the most underserved regions. Her team is behind projects like the Mental Health Million and Student MHQ, which is really helping us track and make sense of mental health at scale. And so today we're going to talk about the work that they're doing at Sapien Labs, how it ties into learning and development, and where this whole field is heading next. Tara, just to get us started, I know some of this, but I think a lot of folks don't know. What actually led you to focus your work on understanding the human mind, and how did Sapien Labs actually come to life?
Wow, yeah, that's going back that way 10 years. So I'm a neuroscientist by training, and I did my PhD really in cellular physiology, and so quite far from anything with humans. I started out working with rats and mice cells and so on, and realized
That's a
that
long way
long
from
way.
humans, yes.
Yeah, but after that, I was actually running a microfinance company in India. I know it's completely different field, and that's a whole different story that I won't get into. But one of the, I was sort of having two parallel tracks, and while I was running this company, I was also had a small lab and had started to move, I would say, up the chain from rats and mice to monkeys. At that point, I was working on data from monkeys and microelectrode arrays implanted in monkey brains. And you know, had always been thinking that really humans are not just bigger rats or mice or even bigger monkeys, and that
I
we
sure
just
hope not.
exactly, and that we really I really did want to do something with humans, but of course,
Yes.
my day job was really running this company, and I'd always been wanted to do something with humans, and so it wasn't until so I guess it's over 10 years ago that we encountered the emotive. And I had a PhD student who had then joined my company as a data science scientist after that, and she was the one who came across the emotive the first time, because we had been talking about, oh, it'd be cool, we've done this monkey work together, it'd be interesting to do humans, but it's so complicated to go and get set up with these EEG equipment,
Sure.
and it's so it's expensive. We've got to go have a whole lab set up and all of this stuff. And so she arrived one day in the office saying, "Look what I found," and sent me the emotive. And so we thought, oh, we could play with this. This is
I
really
love it.
easy, So I said, okay, we don't have to have any lab or anything at all. Just let's get one of these and let's play around with it. First we measured ourselves and our friends and whoever was around, and this was not like we were not actually affiliated with the university. We didn't have any we didn't have any kind of like research project or IRB, anything like that. And we were just playing around with it as with our friends, family, colleagues, whoever would lend their head,
Lend their head,
to
I love
us.
that. Lend their
And
brain, yes.
yeah, yeah. And then, we thought, let's compare, why don't we go to a remote village and see what it looks like over there?
Yes, now that's the fascinating part.
So we went out and it was a small village. It was about, 2-3 kilometers from a road. And so, it didn't have much, there was no, most people didn't have cell phones. It was quite, a few hours from the city. And we just spent the day there, and whoever was willing, and we explained, if you want, we're just playing with this. We'd like to get some, see, what readings we get from your brain and stuff like that. And so it probably was only about 7 or 8, 9 people. And then when we started looking at the data, though, we saw like that this small set of people compared to us and friends and family looked completely different. And that
Right.
was kind of shocking, because I think one of the big things that we all think about, or one of the sort of implicit assumptions in neuroscience, is that there's sort of a prototypical human brain. So physiology should look very similar across all people. And that if you do experiments in one small group that
It'll
you should be able
translate,
to
transfer.
translate,
Yep.
it should extrapolate, right? And so the fact that we were seeing things like 4 or 5 fold different, or some features we couldn't find them in these people, but we could see them in the city folks, our friends and so on, was crazy. And one of our first thoughts was, what, maybe in India and South India especially, they use coconut oil in their hair a lot, and so we thought maybe the sensors are being blocked
Because
because
of the oils,
because of the
right?
oils, and so we're getting a wrong signal and stuff like that. So we did a few more, and then we said, it seems like there might be something there, because if this is real, if it is the case that people in different environments have very different very different physiology of the brain, then this is actually quite profound, because you don't expect, an organ like the heart, you expect the heartbeat to be similar regardless of where you live, where you're from, what you're doing. And so when an organ is behaving quite differently, that says something very profound about how the brain is actually
Yes, because it
probably
changes based on the
changes
environment, the
based on
context,
environment. So at that point, I thought, what, this is really it runs counter to how we think about the brain in neuroscience, and no one is really studying this kind of thing in the world, and so we should do this like seriously and properly.
and so that was how Sapien
That's
Labs
how
was
Sapien
born.
Labs was born. Yeah.
That was amazing. It's really amazing because I remember distinctly one of the presentations you gave, and I remember watching it for the very first time and thinking, wow, this is really groundbreaking work, because you're taking neuroscience, taking it into the context of the real world, and in the context of some of these very remote villages in parts of India, and where they don't have modernization, you are finding very discrete, distinct patterns that are vastly different to what we know in the Western, educated, industrialized, democratized countries. Like what we call the WEIRD acronym, which makes up what 80% of neuroscience research. So you have actually studied brain health now since Sapien Labs was formed over a decade ago. You've actually broadened the study beyond just the differences in brains, which you observed very early, that kind of sparked this interest to dig deeper, to look more broadly at brain health across different environments and communities. And so what kind of patterns or differences have you found, and what has stood out, and what do you see in the EEG?
Yeah, so let me just give you a little bit of background and context of what we've done so far in terms of the research. So one of our goals has been, when we first started, the first study that we did was it essentially in India, and there we were looking at various environmental factors, and then also the looking at people from very remote villages where we low technology, low modernization, all the way to sort of urban hubs where folks are digitally connected and flying places and things like that, and trying to see, is there a progression as these environment changes, and what aspects of environment change. So that was the first study, and we published some papers maybe 6-7 years ago now, or more.
And those findings there were stark,
They're
really
stark, right?
fascinating.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And one of the things there that we saw was that you have uh, that as certain things change, different features of the brain actually shift. And so one of the starkest relationships, and I think this may be the most expected one, is that as you increase, like in years of education, so people who've had no education to primary, secondary, and then college educated, that you see the complexity of the EEG signal is just sort of increases linearly. So that's a sort of expected result, I think. But what was one of the interesting things about that was that you also see that as people's what we called geo footprint increased, meaning the amount that they're traveling, which is sort of a proxy for sort of the novelty of environments that they're encountering and having to navigate and so on. And so the more far and wide they travel, again, the more the complexity of the signal increases. And what's interesting is that the increase with education and the increase with is not they're sort of additive in some way. So it's not that they both increase complexity, but seemingly in different ways.
Fascinating,
So
fascinating.
that's one aspect.
So
The
does
sec
that mean that is it good to have more complexity in your brain?
It seems to be, yes, that at least, there could be other things also that could be related to that, obviously, because there's no metric in the brain that it's like a one-to-one correspondence between, and a particular feature of the EEG and some particular, capability. It's a lot more
Right.
complex than that. But one of the things that it does relate to, and that we found early, was it was, for the higher the complexity, the more likely you are to score high on like certain types of pattern completion tasks and things like that. But that's just one aspect, and I think
Yes.
and it's not a perfect correlation either. Like with a lot of things, there's a distribution, and just on average, you tend to score better. So that is, certainly to me, when that was the first thing that I saw, thinking that, oh, it looks like, there's certain benefits to, obviously, to modern life, and that, the more education you have and the more you can see and so on, the, maybe the better you get at certain types
Or
of tasks.
maybe just more pattern recognition, right?
More
More
pattern
ability
recognition, because
to recognize it. Yeah.
yeah, you've seen so many more different combinations of things in the world, so
Yes.
you're able to, put that stuff together.
Make those things, yeah, make
Yeah,
those things
yeah.
together.
So that was one, and then there was another thing that we saw that was actually quite, and we're still trying to work out what exactly that all means. So the alpha oscillation, which is something that's been a very, it's sort of the most prominent signature of the brain,
Sure.
and
Yes,
that's,
resting EEG is kind of like the baseline for
yeah,
almost
with eyes
everything. Yeah.
closed particularly. So with eyes closed, you get this peak at about 10 hertz in adults, and it's a lower frequency in childhood. It kind of rises, becomes roughly around 10 hertz, and then you can see it decline with age. And so this has been, there's been a lot. I would say it's still not clear what exactly the alpha oscillation is doing, but there are a lot of theories and hypotheses around it, that it has to do with something to do with attention, binding, all sorts of things like that. But one of the things we saw was this didn't have anything to do with, first of all, you know, it doesn't relate so much to these kind of task outcomes as we, for that, at least initially what we looked at. But what was very curious is that we couldn't see the signature at all in the really pre-modern populations, and it was sort of like the strength of that alpha oscillation from the ability to detect it grew as you got into more and more modern environments. And that was kind of curious. It's like, because we think this is like a fundamental feature of how the brain behaves, and why don't you see it in these populations? It could be below, I suspect it's there, but it's below the threshold of detection.
And are you finding that too, Tara, in rural parts, remote parts of India, but also in other parts of the world, Tanzania and other parts? So does it translate
So we're
irrespective
looking at
of
all of that
your
right now. I think we're sort of in the middle of that journey. But what we found, and I can tell you more with more confidence what we see in India, because a lot of the analysis is still going on. Some of the Tanzania work is relatively much
still
newer.
new? Yes.
But what we see is that that we were looking at what environmental factors might shift that, and what we could see is that the amp, sort of the peak, the size of that peak, or how strong that alpha peak was, it changed abruptly with the transition to smartphone. And so, that it was, so once you got the smartphone, and then based on your data use and stuff like that, the peak was getting stronger and stronger. And so the question is, that's quite curious. What does that mean? Is it good to have a very strong alpha peak? Is it not good to have a very strong alpha peak? It's not the frequency itself, but like how big, like what's the energy of that, like how large is that peak? So that's something we're still trying to unravel. And there've been, so that's one. We found another factor that we found is that diet. The more fruit and vegetables you have, the more it changes sort of certain amplitude characteristics of the signal. And so, and that's, so each, so it looks like various factors of physiology are more dominantly influenced by different aspects of your environment. And
Right.
so,
Interesting,
yeah,
fascinating
so
stuff.
that was sort of the initial work that we did.
Let's say, for example, eating fruits and vegetables will result in certain higher amplitude and certain frequencies. Is there and presumably we think some of that is more desirable. How do we think about how do we map some of these activities, behavioral things that we may choose as individuals as we conduct our daily lives? How do we map those to the the kinds of features we might observe in the brain, and how do you think about what does that optimal
Yeah,
configuration
see, I
look like?
think one of the things is that there's so many different ways and so many different features of the signal, and that's another aspect that we're looking at. I think, just as a preamble to answering your question, we've only scratched the surface of how to actually extract meaning out of the EEG, and there's so a lot of, you see, maybe a big chunk of the research just looks at some spectral properties, but that has very few degrees of freedom because you have only one slope and then you can chunk it into some pieces, and that's all that. But there's so many different behaviors and feelings and all of that alone is not going to just map to all of those different things. So there's so much more that you could do with the physiology, and so many more features, more orthogonal aspects of the signal that you can explore. And so really what you find is that there's so much variability across people. So understanding how environment impacts you, it's really like part of it is you really have to track individuals and look at change over time and what that means for outcomes. So the work we're doing now is much larger scale. So the first experiments that I was study that I was talking about was on the order of about 500 people, and now we have data from almost 10,000. So that's a different order of magnitude, and that allows us to look at all these various multivariate factors and how they might be interacting, because it does get quite complex, right? Like, it's not just, say, fruit and vegetable may act on something, but there might be something else that also acts on that,
Yes,
and you have so many
exactly.
different variables. So having that kind of large scale data and having all these multivariate features at once allows you to start to untangle all of that. That said, like you were saying, longitudinal is really important, that you have to see not just longitudinal, but looking at how things change with interventions. Like if we shift you, if been eating really bad food and now you start eating lots of fresh fruit and vegetables, how will your brain signal change? And so those are the kind of things that we are now getting set up to do on the food side, but we've done some of those experiments on other environmental dimensions.
So can you talk about some of the environmental dimensions that you've actually studied, because that is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, so one of the things that we've done, and is that there's been a lot of talk about smartphones and what smartphones are doing to your brain and all of that, and also, so we did this one study recently, and it's not published yet, but I'll sort of give you a bit of a what's coming
Preview.
out of that preview.
Yes.
Yeah. So we took these kids who went to a camp in, it's just teenagers who went to a camp in Maine, and they basically, they're there without phones and in log cabins and, peer to peer, lots of peer to peer interaction, and they're out there in nature. So it's many things changing at once. So you're not just, it's not like you're very controlling, for one thing and trying to see what that one aspect does. But you put them in, so then they go to camp, we measure their EEG at the start of camp. 3 weeks, 3.5 to 4 weeks later, they're leaving. We measure them right before they leave. And then they do a whole lot of, answer a whole lot of surveys and so on. And
Yes.
one of the
You're
things
not
that,
measuring while they're in camp, though. We're measuring before and after the camp
yeah,
experiences.
before and after the camp
Great.
experience.
Great.
Yeah.
And how old are these?
These are
This
like
pop-
between 14 to 18, 14,
Oh,
15, I
okay.
guess
Okay.
mostly 15, 16, I would say. And so, these are some of the early experiments that we've done, and, just about 30, 30, 40 kids. And we could see already that you see shifts, even in just 3 weeks, you can see shifts in certain aspects of the signal. So we've got, for example, you see the slope of the power spectrum shifts, and in a way and you see also correspondingly this reported increase in stability and calmness, and reduced impulsivity, which at least hypothesis wise that the slope with ideas that there's it relates to more inhibition, this change in slope, and so possibly there's a relationship there, but there's a lot that still needs to be done to really nail down a lot of these things. But that's an example of how you can see in a very short time quite a consistent shift across a small population of kids. So what the environment you experience is constantly changing the physiology, reshaping it. Yeah.
What are we learning about how we should potentially shape education to maybe achieve better outcomes for young people, especially
Yeah.
when we have a mental health crisis on our hands in so many
Absolutely,
parts of the
absolutely. So
world?
some of the things that we're looking at now, and I won't speak to results because I think these are still very much in the I won't tell you details rather, but just some of the general directions. But ultra processed food is something that we found, so fruits and vegetables obviously have these positive impacts on certain things. Ultra processed food does something totally different and seems to impact other kinds of metrics in terms of how fast, like how the signal does shifting between states and so on. And we find, and we're still trying to nail down, does that correlate to the reported decrease in emotional control and cognitive control that people report, that's very, very tightly associated with eating ultra processed food, even when you control for a lot of other things. And so, the food environment is obviously really important. So, the good side, also the bad side. I think clearly, and we have to say we'll publish exactly what, but clearly they all have some, very significant impact on the physiology. And then the smartphones seem to do something which we're still trying to understand with respect to the alpha oscillation and so on. So I think it really, and all of these again end up having some kind of cognitive impact also. If you don't have control over the network, of the nervous system, then focusing or controlling your anger, they all rely on a stable a stable nervous system. From the perspective of schools, I would say that, if you want good learning outcomes, then environment really matters. You want the kids, and we call this sort of, to grow up with strong minds, which means that the brain is also sort of optimally stable and able to function effectively. And it really matters what environment they're put in. And we're starting to see all of the, from the food to the technology environment to the social environment. And this is another very big aspect, is the social environment. And there we have a lot of very exciting things we're looking at on face to face, like what happens when people look at each other versus or online.
Right, absolutely. That is fascinating. I can't wait until you publish those results. We've heard the phrase, you are what you eat, and it does sound like there's an element of that, right? We do need to eat healthy foods. What you put in your body manifests itself now. It looks like also in terms of cognitive impacts as well, in terms of how it affects your cognitive abilities. The exposure to technology, which is a very big part of our daily lives as well. Now, I wonder if we'll be able to get to a point where you can recommend a certain level of exposure for certain age groups. So there's, as a mother of a very young child, I'm very hesitant to give her access to technology early because, on the one side you say it does allow this greater connectivity, right, to form in the brain early. But at the same time, we are seeing some of the social aspects of withdrawal if there's too much of it. And so finding that, I wonder if you'll get to a point where you'll be able to create some recommendations, general
Yeah,
recommendations for.
absolutely. I mean, I think we certainly can, provide already recommendations at the level of just what the outcome, how these various environmental factors relate to the sort of the mental outcomes. I think getting the impact on the brain and what exactly it's doing to the brain. I think that we're a little bit newer in that right now, partly because of COVID, and we shut down a lot of the research for a few years because we couldn't
Yes.
continue in the field. But I think even now, it's not just so yes, I would say the chemical or molecular environment, which is all the molecules that go into building the brain and the outcomes that it's able to produce, but also the stimulus environment. So, the things like the education or travel or technology, they're all shape the stimulus environment in different ways. One of the very interesting things, and I'll give you a bit of a preview on this because I think it's one of the most exciting and it be one of the most exciting and insightful directions, is that when you, like in these kids with camp, they're now without a phone, so they're in a cabin with 14 other kids.
Yes.
And so there's a lot more face-to-face interaction than if they're all the time, talking to each other.
Yes,
Yeah. I mean, they sit next to each other and talk through Instagram or something, or
Yes.
whatever they do nowadays. And what we see is that there is a, increase in sort of synchrony, mutual information, that kind of thing between two people when they look at each other that's not there through on screen. And this is in the EEG, right? So, and you can see
Yes, so
that
it's measurable. It's
measurable
very
in
clearly
the
measurable.
EEG, and you can see that it shifts when you're in a more social environment. And to me, that's sort of maybe an insight into our design, that the human brain is designed to be social. A huge part of the brain is dedicated to faces and recognizing, small facial movement expressions, body language, so many factors that are in-person touch. And all of this is and we're just looking at just face-to-face looking, no talking, no nothing. And even that creates a different, sort of brain-to-brain connectivity. And that we might be disrupting quite significantly with technology. And it's one of our original designs that made us social species that was
Social
able
species.
to that's able to cooperate and create things greater than the sum of the parts. And if we start to lose that capability, I think it will be very destructive for society, which relies on our ability to cooperate.
I love the fact that you're actually able to quantify this. So we talk a lot about how we're concerned about the social withdrawals that children and young teens are facing because of the proliferation of devices and the amount of time they're spending in these digital worlds. But I think that it's quite difficult to quantify what exactly is happening in the brain when you do something different. And I think one of the things that is most fascinating about the work that you're doing through Sapien Labs is you're actually measuring brains in those environments before, and then seeing this change in that, as you say, they spend these few weeks amongst their peers, and then you're measuring afterwards, so we can actually quantify the actual changes that you're seeing in the brain itself. And I think that ability to quantify the change is truly fascinating, because it gives us a scientific basis for what we kind of instinctively believe is right, but hard to kind of put a finger on it. I think that's incredible. So where are you going next with this research?
Well, I mean, there's so much to do.
There's so much.
There's
exactly.
so much just in this alone.
You're just getting started.
For us to really nail down all of these different aspects and how they're influencing the brain, and across various diverse types of occupations. Another very interesting thing is by occupation, you can actually predict who's lives in what type of like lifestyle, and from whether you're out farming or sitting in an office.
So what you're saying is, if you look at my EEG, you can tell if I'm an office worker or a farmer just based on my brain activity. Yeah, isn't that fascinating?
So those kinds of things are happening. Yeah. And I think there's so much that, when we have this kind of large data, we start to understand all of the facets by which different aspects of environment are starting to shape your brain physiology. And that has, it's just fascinating scientifically and all of that. But really, I think the applications of this are very significant. One is that how do we, from a preventative or from a, how do we essentially create environments for children, as parents, as schools, even as countries, how do we create environments that are optimal for the brain health and the mind health of its populations? And so
Absolutely.
really understanding that, I think, is one of the major aspects. And there will be so many different dimensions on this, from, food environment to the, chemical and pollution toxin environment, to the work environment, to
The
lifestyles
social
and
environment,
social
lifestyle.
environment,
Yeah.
built environment. I mean, there's so many different dimensions to explore in this. But the other aspect is also medical, right? Like, if we are so diverse, how do you think about medical diagnostics for brain health? Because the assumption for any kind of diagnostic would be that, okay, if everybody behaves the same, then it's much easier to say, okay, this is what your this is what you have. And I think part of the challenge that we've had as a field in terms of having real medical diagnostics for brain health, which there aren't other than for, tumors or something like that, which you can image. I mean, even
Yes.
something like a seizure, it's really hard for people to actually identify what is an actual seizure, because it's basically, all it tells you is something's gone acutely wrong. We
Yes.
don't know what, but if you could get more perspective on the network itself, and all of the different features and factors that go into that, that you could become much more specific in how you diagnose a lot of different neurological conditions as well, and in context, so you understand that this person's life context is this, and therefore maybe this is the parameter space of their brain physiology given that context, and diagnostics would have to take that into consideration.
That's amazing. I absolutely agree. I couldn't agree more with what you're saying. There's so much general diversity that exists, and we often think of the of so many things and try to oversimplify and cluster people
Yeah.
into groups. And this allows us to see how the environment, the social environment, the modernization infrastructure of a particular place, how that actually shapes the brain's physiology and how we might treat people in those particular circumstances. We talked a little bit about younger people. What about people who are aging? Have you looked at that, the other part of the continuum? There's a lot of interest now around longevity and what can we do to look after our brain. And one of the things that is a really big indicator of whether you're going to have a good life is actually your brain health as well,
Mhm.
right? Whether you're going to have good longevity is your brain health. And so, how do we think about that? And have you learned anything from the research that might give us some nuggets there too?
Yes and no. I think we haven't actively looked at the older population specifically with that in mind, primarily because we're seeing such a huge challenge in younger generations. And so clearly, like, environment has changed so profoundly for younger
Yeah.
generations that that's
And
where
it's
a lot of the
accelerating.
it's
Yeah.
accelerating. That's
Right.
where a lot of the problems are. So we've really put more of our
Sure.
focus into the younger, what's happening with younger generations. That said, what we can see is things like, and we haven't, again, all unpublished, and so we're still in the process of looking at it. But then, what we will be able to tell you is certain types of things, like what features of your brain change more rapidly with age. So we know that certain features are do start to decline with age, but if you have certain lifestyles, it might decline more steeply. And so we're starting to pull out some of those sorts of things, and I'm hesitant to say, because it's not yet fully nailed down and submitted for publication or anything. So I don't want to have to retract my words when I go back and say, oh wait, I
Yes.
did a different
That,
analysis, and now it's
so,
like,
so if people are interested, when,
yeah.
roughly when and where might they be able to find the research?
Well, I think these will all, academic publishing is just so long, but from the time
Yes.
you submit to the time you get reviews back, and it's like sometimes it takes like a year. So it's just, it's really long. But I hope that, starting in 26, we'll start to see more of these, more of these papers come out. But the other aspect I should mention, since I think you have a lot of EEG audience, is that, this 10,000, this data from 10,000 people, and it's now 10,000, but it's growing every day because we have full-time teams on the ground in India and Tanzania that are gathering data every day from various different populations with a whole lot of environmental context data, and then also outcome, mental health, and other kinds of cognitive outcomes, and so on. And that data will be made available, hopefully by January, to the EEG community, research community. So, there's just so much in there that we hope lots of people will download the data and use it.
Oh, that's
and
wonderful.
I should mention we're, for this research with the 10,000, we use the Emotive Flex.
The 32 channel system, which is fantastic.
Yeah, but we're using only 16 channels of the 32, mainly for speed. Yes. But we do find that you can get, a lot out of, like, actually even 4 channels gives you a lot of information.
A lot of information.
So yeah, just to keep the time for setup and things faster.
Yeah. That's why our epoch is only 14 channels. I absolutely think that's right.
It's honestly sufficient. I think, on that, we started out working, our first set of experiments were with the epoch. But one of the things, I guess when we were scaling, we found the Flex to be a lot more useful, mainly for 2 reasons. One is that you have, the gel system obviously is better, like if you're doing longer experiments and you don't want it to kind of dry out. The saline, but also just if one electrode goes off, or it's easier to work with, like to replace one channel or something like that. Whereas with the epoch we couldn't. But we loved both the devices, and we're finding it's great for this kind of scalability. So
I can't wait to have access to the data. 10,000 data sets, EEG data sets labeled. With metadata as well, with all of these really interesting intrinsic properties, January 2026.
Yeah, I don't hold me to a hard date there, but, early next year.
So you've spent a lot of time looking at how our environment, behavior, mental health are all connected. If there was one thing that you wanted people to understand about the brain as a takeaway, what would that be?
It's just that the brain has evolved to be responsive to the environment. And so it's, you might think of it as this is how I am, or I'm static, like, that it's a static thing, but there's so many factors that can change it. And so it is very much an evolving organ, and you can really change things with your lifestyle for better outcomes. And, the brain is built for that.
I love that. I love that message. It's an evolving system, right? That's the takeaway. So it's an evolving system. What we do every day actually matters. And so I think that's so profound. It's a very different outlook to if we think that this is a static system that we can't change. But the fact is, yes, it's always changing, and we have so many mechanisms. The fact that, you can change it within a few weeks.
Exactly.
Just change is incredible. I love it. Tara, thank you so much for spending time with us today. I think the work that you are doing is absolutely fundamental to helping us understand brains across cultures, environments, social contexts, and it is so valuable to have your voice in this field. So thank you for sharing your learnings, your insights with us, and I'm excited for all the updates that you'll share soon.
Yeah, thank you. And we couldn't have done all of this without Emotive. So we're also very grateful that you put that out there to make this possible.
Thanks, Tara. Thank you so much.
Thank you.